And I have 1 o'clock, so let's get started. Hello and welcome to the webinar. Some of you may already know me from last week's webinar, but in case you don't, my name is Carrie Berger, and I am the Associate Program Leader for Oregon State University's Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Program. And this coming Monday, I begin my new role as the Fire Program Manager for the Extension Fire Program. So as I said last week, one of the objectives of the FIRE program is to provide education and outreach opportunities to all of Oregon. Hosting webinars is just one way we can accomplish that. So this webinar is part of a series of webinars we are providing on wildfire preparedness and prevention in the month of May. Perhaps you were online with us last Friday to hear about what the fire problem is and what the fire conditions look like in Oregon, and what you can do to prevent wildfires. If not, catch the webinar recording on our Forestry and Natural Resources Extension YouTube channel. Today, we are focusing on fire behavior, embers, risk assessment, and the home ignition zone. Coming up next week, we will focus on fire-adapted communities and what it means to be prepared by Ready, Set, Go. We'll also have a live demonstration from a community emergency response team member showing us their go bag and how you can prepare your own go bag. So if you haven't already, please register for this webinar. Okay, we have, like last week, another great lineup of speakers, and I'll take a minute to introduce them to you now. Presenting first, we have Steve Fitzgerald. Steve is an extension silviculture specialist with Oregon State University. Hey, Steve.
How's it going, everybody?
Then we have Daniel Lavelle up next, and Daniel is an extension forester in Klamath and Lake counties for OSU Extension. Hey, Daniel.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Carrie.
Thanks for coming back on this week as well.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And we also have with us today Jenna Trentadue. Jenna is the National Fire Plan Coordinator with the Oregon Department of Forestry. And Ryan Gordon is also here with us from ODF, and he is their Family Forest Land Coordinator. Hey, guys.
Hey, Carrie. Hey, everybody.
So just a big welcome to all the speakers. We're so glad to have you all with us. Okay, so before we dive into the presentations, there's just a couple of housekeeping items we should discuss before getting started. First off, your audio has been muted, so please type any questions you have for the speakers in the Q&A window. Q&A can be found in the bottom portion of your screen and is labeled Q&A. I will be recording this webinar and will post it on the FIRE program website and the Forestry and Natural Resource Extension YouTube channel. Don't worry about taking notes or trying to remember these website names. Like last time, I'll provide you all with a list of resources in a follow-up email. Finally, I will be using the polling function to ask you a couple of questions throughout the webinar. When I launch a poll, a window should pop up and you should be able to click your answers. If a window does not pop up, then go to the polling option found at the bottom portion of your screen and enable the polling function there. So let's kick off with a poll. And let me launch that poll. Okay, so you should be seeing a poll. There are 3 questions with this poll. Basically, we just want to know where you're calling in from, and are you a woodland owner, or are you a professional, natural resources professional? And do you own acreage? We'd like to hear that. And so I'll just give Steve just a minute to have folks go ahead and respond to that. And lots of people are polling in, and looks like we have a lot of folks from the Willamette Valley, and again, Southwest Oregon. And a lot of folks not owning forest land or 10 acres or less. And just give that another couple seconds here. If you haven't already clicked the button, go ahead and do so. We have a really good response rate so far. Look, we even have people from outside the US. And I'm going to share this here in a second. So Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. So most of you are from the Valley. And Steve, it looks like we've got a lot of people from Southwest Oregon as well, and even Washington State. And lots of woodland owners, and most people owning 10 acres or less. So great, thank you for sharing that information with us. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Steve. Go ahead, Steve. You know, fire behavior is such a big topic, and usually this could be like a half-day class. But for today, I'm going to have you drill it down into 10 minutes. So go for it.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And thanks to everyone for attending the webinar today. It's a really nice and sunny day here in Corvallis, Oregon. My presentation will be brief, but it sets the stage for providing background information for the other presentations you'll hear today. As Carrie mentioned, I'm from OSU and have worked on fire and fire issues for over 30 years, both in the dry forest and in the wetter west side forest of Oregon. In thinking about the fire environment in which we live and work and play, nearly every place on the planet will burn if there's combustible carbon. The only places absent of fire, of course, the Arctic and Antarctic, or other places that are devoid of vegetation. But natural wildfire ignitions, as you learned before, are caused by lightning, and other wildfires are human caused, mostly from escaped debris burns, carelessness, arson, and others. But I should also mention that Native Americans historically fired the North American landscape, and thus humans have always been a part of the natural fire regime on Earth. So we all know that it's not a question of if fire will occur, it's a matter of when, and will you and your community be prepared when it comes. We know that in the last few decades, wildfires have become more frequent, intense, and burn with higher severity. Thus, the risk to people and human infrastructure is high, and there's an increased need to mitigate our situation to reduce the potential impacts of wildfire in the future. So let's talk a little bit about fire behavior basics. In order to sustain a fire, and you probably all know this, is that you need three things. You need oxygen, you need fuel, and you need heat or an ignition source, and this is known as the fire triangle. If you take one of these away, such as like oxygen, when you use a chemical fire extinguisher to put out a grease fire, it basically removes the oxygen and suffocates the fire, and the fire goes out. However, there's another triangle called the fire behavior triangle. And when a fire erupts, its behavior is affected by topography. So steepness of slopes, south slopes, north slopes, elevation, the weather, and of course, fuel. And when I speak of fire behavior, I mean these things: the rate of spread, how fast the fire moves, the length of the flames, whether the trees are torching or crowning, whether they're spotting, which are embers that drop in front of the fire and ignite these small spot fires in front, or whirling, or otherwise known as fire tornadoes. These last four elements are really dangerous fire situations, but they occur quite regularly on wildfires today. So in thinking about this, if you have an ignition and the weather gets hot and dry and windy, kind of like we had last week, east winds typically we see in August and September, that's when you have to really be careful. And what we do is we see the potential for flames to move faster, to be higher, more intense, and to burn with higher severity. Okay, so likewise, if the weather changes to cooler and wetter conditions, the fire spread and the flame lengths and the intensity of the fire decrease, which can aid firefighters in extinguishing the flames. in both of these triangles, fuel is really the common denominator. And it's really the only element that we can manipulate before wildfire strikes. And when we think about fuel, we need to look at the amount of fuel. And so this is the totality of all the fuel, including the home and any outbuildings you might have. And think of them as boxes of concentrated fuels. But also think about the landscape vegetation around your home and the native vegetation out beyond that, and that of your neighbors, potentially. The arrangement of the fuel around your home is important. And here is how contiguous are the fuels around your home and property. Can fire move unabated through continuous fuels down here at the surface on the ground, or can they move up into the canopy through ladder fuels? And the size of the fuel affects the speed and degree to which fuels dry out or wet up, and their ability to ignite and sustain combustion. So such as small fuels, needles, leaves, small branches, shrubs, medium-sized branches, and small and large logs. But also in thinking about the fuels, there's some fuels are more flammable than others. Volatile oils and chemicals can aid fire ignition. And we know that some native plants contain volatile oils, making them very, very flammable. Ornamental plants, such as juniper or arborvitae, are examples of plants that are highly, highly flammable. And of course, there are other things around your home that are flammable, such as lawn furniture that can catch an ember and put your home at risk. And looking at this home, overall, it looks pretty good. Fuels have been removed, yet it's still an attractive landscape. Well, homeowners can sometimes unknowingly create fuel conditions that put their home and property at risk, particularly when landscaping. This home here was involved in a wildfire in Bend, Oregon. The homeowner had done some thinning and limbing up of trees. In addition, they had some green lawn around the home. The main fire went around the house, yet this home was nearly lost to the fire. To the right of the driveway and above the vehicle, there was a hedge of ornamental juniper that I colored here in green. A firebrand moved into the hedge and ignited it. And the fire moved to the base of the pine trees and torched those trees, conveying flames up and charring the eaves of the roof. The only reason this house survived is because a fire crew happened to be nearby to douse the flames. Here, the homeowner had done some really good fuel reduction work around their home, but they were unaware that the type and arrangement of landscape vegetation could pose a threat. And this is really a textbook example of a constructed fuel ladder. So after the webinar, you may want to take a look at the landscape vegetation around your home. And with that, I will end my presentation and pass it off to Daniel Lavelle. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Steve, for that presentation. You mentioned firebrands, which is maybe a fancy word for embers, right?
Yes.
Great. Yeah. And so Daniel is actually going to talk to us about embers and why we should worry about embers and also risks. So Daniel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Like Steve said, let me see if I can get this to advance. Let's see.
Daniel, just on the lower left-hand side of your screen, there's a couple of arrows. There you go. Just, yep.
Okay, it's not advancing. Here, let me stop and try to do that again. Okay, so based on what Steve was saying, when a fire occurs, not if, but when a fire occurs, the boxes of fuel we live in, there are unfortunately many ways a structure can burn. And this video illustrates a research project that was conducted. They built a home in a warehouse, and they demonstrated that homes can burn by direct contact with flame. They can burn by radiant heat nearby a structure, but they can also burn, and what I want to talk about today, by showers of embers with no flame present, blown by the wind in wind-driven fires, as this video demonstrates. What they did, they took organic matter, they put it into bins that ignited, blew the embers at roughly 20 miles per hour at a distance towards this structure. The structure was built out of different materials, some more flammable than others. So one side of the house was wood siding, the other side was more of a flame-resistant concrete-based siding. They had shake roofs, shakes on the roof in one part. They had shingles on the other part of the roof, and they blew the embers at about 20 miles per hour towards the house. And what this demonstrated was how the various building materials ignited and at what rate. And if you could take a look and take note of the gutters, on one part of the house they had plastic gutters, on another part of the house they had aluminum gutters, and the plastic gutters, this is just from embers flying in, burnt debris in the gutters that melted the plastic gutters, causing the roof to ignite hotter, and the shrubs and material around the house ignited. That's all it takes. Where there was wood siding, burned. Where there was flame resistant siding, it withheld the fire from burning. So it really drives home what embers can do. Keep in mind, this is only a 20 mile per hour wind synthesis. On the Kincaid fire last year in California, they recorded winds of over 90 miles an hour. 90 mile an hour can drive like a sugar pine cone a mile and a half up to 2 miles ahead of a flaming fire front, driven by winds like that, to drop onto structures. So like Steve said, and I've seen it many times, you can do a lot of work, and you should, around the home, but if a fire should approach, it can be extremely hazardous.
Hey, Daniel, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yes.
Daniel, sorry, this is Carrie. It might be worth just stopping the video at this point, because I think it's drawing from your bandwidth and causing your audio to go in and out. So just, okay, I'd say forward to the next slide if you can.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to do.
There you go. Perfect.
So I want to talk about risk assessment, and I want to look at risk assessment, fire risk assessment, a little bit differently than we've approached it in the past. And I hope this will have a little bit more significance. Doggone it. Yeah, here, let me, I had this problem before. Carrie, can you play that PowerPoint, please?
Daniel, I'll call it up, but I would say just continue on, okay?
Okay, so when you look at risk assessment, the first thing to do is to look at risk at identifying the hazard you're dealing with. If you want to know how to deal with risk, wildfire risk, identify your hazard. Fire is a hazard. Fire is a hazard, and think of fire as a hazard like you would a stepladder as a hazard. Believe it or not, 160,000 people a year are injured by falling off step ladders 10 feet or shorter. 300 people die every year in this country from misusing a step ladder. A step ladder is a hazard. Fire is a hazard. A step ladder, to mitigate that hazard, you need to build a strong ladder or get a new ladder. You need to red tag ladders that are shaky or rotten, and you need to follow the rules. But if you're like me, there's always that extra 2 feet you want to reach. So you go up on the top rung of the ladder, and the risk is magnified. The consequences are magnified. So think of the consequences slight to extreme, and the likelihood of that happening remote to almost certain. That is how you should approach fire risk assessment. Identify fire as a hazard, which can be beneficial, just like a ladder. A fire can be detrimental. It can be a hazard that causes harm, and the ladder can do the same thing. So, yeah, next slide. So wildfire, so it starts with a risk assessment. You identify the hazard on that risk assessment. And that's what you would do if you did a risk assessment of your structure, of your property, of the landscape. You identify the hazard. In other words, fire is more of a hazard on a steep south aspect than it is on a flat, northerly, more wet environment aspect. Wildfire is more of a hazard in the summertime when you have red flag days, when it's drier, less humidity, fire becomes more of a hazard. Wildland fire is less of a hazard in the middle of winter with 2 feet of snow on the ground, but interior fire is more of a hazard in the winter when you're burning more wood in your stove, you're cooking more, but in the summer, it tends to slack off. So fire is a hazard. Now you need to measure the likelihood of it causing you harm or your resources harm. You can reduce that by doing some of the measures Steve mentioned and some of the measures that will be mentioned by Jenna and Ryan and some in the next webinar. You lessen the possibility of a hazard causing severe consequences, and you will never get, and that's a measure of risk. Next slide, please. Can you?
Daniel, I'm pretty sure that was the last slide.
Okay. Okay, the one before that, real quick, please. Okay, so wildfire is a hazard with consequences that vary, like Steve said, depending on weather, topography, and fuels. And I want to validate what he says. We don't have control over the weather and topography. We have control over starting fires and reducing fuels. We can reduce the likelihood of calamity and reduce the consequences of that calamity by reducing the fuels, lessening the risk, it's lessening the hazard itself. That reduces relative risk. So thank you very much. And Ron are next.
Great, thank you for that, Daniel. And I hope everybody could see those slides okay. And so that's great to transition to Jenna and Ryan, who are gonna tell us about actions that homeowners can take in the home ignition zone. So Jenna, go ahead when you're ready.
Great, thank you, Carrie, and appreciate being here. I had no idea how dangerous step ladders were. I'll definitely say that. But a lot of good information. I'm going to reiterate a little bit of the things that Daniel and Stephen talked about, but hopefully, give me just a second. I'll get this full screen for you guys. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the home ignition zones. I got a lot of pictures and hoping to kind of roll through this for you guys. Home ignition zones, I'm going to give you a kind of a picture of that here in a minute. But first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about, why do we want to do defensible space? Why do we find that this is important? I think one of the biggest things I run into with people when I'm talking to them about any kind of natural disaster fears that they have or any kind of concerns that they have is people ask me, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference? What can I do to protect myself? And sometimes that seems like such a big thing to take on, but really it's not. In these kind of situations, there's kind of a self-empowerment piece where you have a lot of control over how much risk your home and your property and livelihood and everything is at. And there's a lot of steps you can take, and that's what we're here to kind of talk to you about. So how do you protect your home? How do you minimize your risk? Create a plan. There's a lot that can go into these kind of plans. I'm going to keep it sort of high level, but I'll kind of chat about what different things you can do with that. Of course, we want to protect our firefighters. That's why we do the defensible space, partially because if your home is a complete mess and it's full of brush and people, the firefighters are coming to save the homes in your neighborhood and yours isn't accessible, they might pass you by. That's something that people don't think about. They think, oh, they're going to come save my home no matter what. That's not necessarily the case. If they don't have access, if they can't get to it, and there's lots of homes that are on fire in your neighborhood, they might go to the one that they can get to and save. So you're really doing yourself a service by making there better access for our firefighters, making it safer for them too. And then lastly, it's often just an expansion of the work that you're already doing. All you have to do is kind of think about some of the things you already do on an annual basis through the lens of kind of fire preparedness. So I'm going to give you some examples here. We'll go through it. This is a picture kind of your overall home ignition zone. We've got the immediate zone, which is just right around your home. Then we have the 5 to 30 foot, which is kind of, your yard, your expansion area. And then out to the extended zone of 30 to 100 feet. There's kind of a fourth zone that's beyond the 100 foot if you've got a big piece of property. We'll touch a little bit on that, but mostly the home ignition zone, we're going to kind of focus right in that first 100 foot away from your home. So your first zone is going to be your 0 to 5 foot. This is just right around your home. When you first walk out the door, what do you see when you look to the side? Some of the things that we kind of talk about with that when we go through assessments with people in their homes is that lean, clean, green. Okay, the greener your plants are, the more watered they are, the less likely they are to catch on fire. So if you can keep your plants green, that's helpful. Also, keeping it clean, any kind of debris that's up next to the home, if you've got dead leaves, any kind of bark mulch, things like that, those are really prime for those embers that Daniel was talking about that can catch right up next to your home and start a fire. And those are huge. The embers are actually a higher threat generally to homes than the fire itself. So these are the kind of things you want to be thinking about is those embers. What can those embers catch on? So using rock, removing the mulch from the side of your home. You can have mulch further out on like these islands that I'll talk about, but next to the home, that's not advised at all. Think about your decks, your walkways, what's burnable there. Removing those overhanging branches that are going to start to kind of cause a lot of that debris and things to build up on the home itself, on the house. Keeping those gutters free of that debris. Don't store your firewood right up next to the house. Things like that. So just kind of start thinking about it through the lens of fire preparedness. So next, the fire resistant landscaping. So this is kind of what I'm talking about. I just wanted to give you some visuals here. So, you've got this kind of thing in the corner here that's all the rock and everything like that. There's a way here that they sort of created this rock yard. Now, I don't recommend everybody do this, but it's just a good example of how you can make something sort of aesthetically pleasing without, creating some of the fire hazards that a lot of people try to do around their home. To the right there in the corner, they've got kind of these islands that they've got of plants. And I like this. Sometimes people really want to have, kind of that aesthetically beautiful side to it and keep their luscious plants and everything like that. But we still want to be mitigating for the fire piece. And that's where they have some of their rock walkways and they kind of have some of their plants more contained. Now that's not super low risk, but everything that you do to minimize your risk is a better chance, right? So we want to just minimize as much as we can. In this bottom corner, we're also looking at kind of this beautiful deck that they have that's kind of a, this kind of area that's completely, you know, cement or whatever. And then they've got their flowers up in these little kind of islands, again, that's contained. So think about it that way when you're looking around your home. So these are kind of some visuals of sort of, you know, keep that debris off of your roof and gutters, keep your decking enclosed with an 1/8 inch of screen, non-flammable materials such as concrete and rock. You gotta think about it. Your home is very vulnerable right up in a lot of those corners under your deck. If you don't have it enclosed, all that stuff that gets, you know, accumulated inside of there, that's all just prime for starting fire. From embers, if there's any kind of fire that comes near you. And embers go very, very far. They can go up to miles from where the fire is. So you are vulnerable. Make sure you prune back those branches from the side of the house. You don't need to remove trees necessarily. We're not saying that. You want to create some separation from ground fuels and kind of those branches up there. So I'll show you some visuals of that as well. So again, they talked about kind of, you know, Daniel got into it a little bit about the building materials. Now, we don't expect you to go out and redo your roof. That's a very expensive endeavor, but I would highly recommend if you're in a situation where you have a wood shake roof and it's time to get a new roof, you're at the end of the 30 years or whatever you've got. I highly recommend you go with a material that's, you know, composite roofing or something that's just not flammable type of things, because those wood shake roofs get people more often than you'd think. Choosing fire resistant deck and lawn furniture as well. Here's a place in Oregon. I'm going to show you a couple before and after pictures. So we've got, you know, that before where they've got the the tree. I'm going to go back to it real quick here. This big tree right up next to the home. They've got kind of wood siding there. So this is why they removed the tree. We don't necessarily say you have to, but in this case, it was a best choice. And then their deck, they don't have anything under their deck, which is highly advisable as well. So the next part, this is kind of just a quick example of a fire situation where, you know, in Ashland, Oregon in 2010 from the Oak Knoll fire, I actually took this from Stephen Fitzgerald. There was 12 homes in a row and 11 of them burned. This was the 12th home that didn't burn. So looking at this, you can see there's mature vegetation, open space, there's a lack of fire-prone vegetation within the 30 feet, and there's no ladder fuels. And so these are all pieces that really made sure that this home didn't burn. There was a couple of other pieces to this, but kind of the main thing to take home is, as you can see, is that defensible space really came into play, and that's part of why it didn't burn. And the ones that did, as you can see, they had plenty of, you know, these hedges and brush and things that burned the homes up. So these were the rest of them that did burn. So zone 2 is that 5 to 30 foot mark. This is a little bit further out from your home. You just want to start thinking about, again, through that fire lens, that pruning up the trees, removing brush, thinning and spacing vegetation, keeping things clear around your sheds and fences, especially if they're wooden. Think about those as kind of ladders. So you don't want the fence, that wooden fence, to go all the way up to the home. Maybe you've got a metal gate that separates that wooden fence from the house itself. And just little things like that that you can do to minimize your risk. And that same thing with the fire piles, you know, making sure that those are as far away from the home as possible. If you don't have 30 feet on your property, find the furthest corner and make a little spot for it. Put a metal shed out there, whatever you can do to get that away from the side of the house, because that's basically kindling to start a fire next to your home. Recycle, compost, yard debris whenever possible. Making sure that your addresses are clearly marked and visible. That's not just for fire, that's also for medical. Anytime you want somebody to be able to find you in an emergency, you need to have something clearly marked where you are at. So some before and after. This is the, sorry, this is sort of jumping through. So before, this is the blackberry bushes kind of making this big old pile here, and this is after they cleaned everything up. You can see kind of how nice and park-like that turned out. This area is sort of this, you know, again, you know, all of the ladder fuels there, and they cleaned it all up. And it looks a lot better. Now, some of that will look better over time. And then this is the kind of, you can't see anything in there, but there's actually a house behind there. So once they cleared all of that out, that took away all of that fuels. And so this is kind of an example too. This was a skeleton fire in 1996 in Bend, Oregon. This was surrounded by, you know, an irrigated lawn. So they got that green kind of clean area, and then the driveway on the back side, and that saved this home. So that 30 foot was, you know, completely taken care of, and that defensible space, it saved their property from being burned down. As you can see, it was a pretty significant fire there. So the third zone is that 30 to 100 foot. So, you know, you want to, when you're thinking about that 30 to 100 foot, you want to think, you know, about that thinning, really focusing though on tree quality and health. I really want to stress that when you're thinking about fire, you also need to think about the health of the vegetation around you, because, you know, you might have to hit like a 12 to 14 foot spacing between your trees. But if this tree over here is a super healthy tree and this other one is kind of dying and not doing well, I would, and you know, one spaced perfectly and the other one's not, of course, go with the healthier tree. We want to have resilient landscape. We want to have healthy ecosystems. We want to, you know, engage in that piece of it along with the fire preparedness part. So, you know, kind of having that dueling thing, they can work together rather than against each other. So also those ladder fuels and kind of creating those habitat vegetative islands are kind of a great way to integrate people who are interested in like habitat and wanting to like, maybe they want to support the birds or some sort of animals on their property, but they're still concerned about wildfire. That's where we would suggest something like a habitat island, where they create an area that's for that, but then create kind of a defensible space around that area where they create separation from the rest of their property. So there's a lot of ways to work with it. You don't have to moonscape your property in order to become more fire safe. So these are just some general recommendations about tree pruning when you're looking at kind of that further out part of things. You want to keep the shrubs a minimum of 10 feet away from the lower edge of branches. These are kind of general guidelines. Basically, you just, if you're doing some sort of pruning and stuff with the trees, you don't want it to, you don't want to cut more than like a third of the bottom of the tree, or else you start to inhibit the health of the tree itself. So you don't want to kill off the trees that you're trying to prune up. So just keep that in mind. And these vary based on where you're at in Oregon. So like I said, that's kind of a general guideline. So this is kind of just another before and after looking further out. That was kind of before, and then afterwards they cleaned this up. And just kind of heads up anybody who's interested in asking questions. I think we're waiting to the end to do that, but I'd be happy to address anything that's coming up here. So again, this is kind of before, and then after they cleared some of the trees out, but you can see there's a lot more room for some of those to sort of get cleaned up and grow. These were invasive species, so they've got the ivy and everything there. And then they cut all the ivy off the trees, which chokes out the trees. It's really bad for them. So that's going to increase the health and resiliency of that property. And hopefully they do a little bit more work, or else all that ivy is going to sort of grow back. But this is just another home that survived a wildfire. Again, you're looking at that beyond, you know, closer to that 100-foot spacing out there. And that essentially is going to, you know, that saved this home because they did all that pruning and stuff of those trees on their property. Then it wasn't able to get up into the crowns and mess it up. So that concludes my side of it. Kind of there's the beyond part, which is beyond that 100-foot. There's still a lot of work people can do on their properties beyond that. I highly recommend that you talk to your local person, whoever you're comfortable with, the fire department, ODF, even any kind of natural resource agency, if you want to have more information on, you know, how to do more of an assessment specifically for your home. So Ryan's going to go ahead and take over at this point and have him kind of talk a little bit more about what opportunities we have. And so thank you guys for listening.
Unmute myself. Great, thank you, Jenna. I'm gonna kind of pick up where Jenna left off here. Let me get my screen sharing going here. So I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the assistance programs that are available to help landowners with some of this work. But before I do that, I wanted to pick up just a little bit on a theme that you heard Jenna talking about there towards the end of her presentation. And that is that your interests, may, for your property, for your forest, may really go beyond just fire and fuels, especially when you're looking outside of the home site. People have a lot of different objectives. I've got some of them listed here. Forest health is a big one, of course. Wildlife, aesthetics, recreation, grazing, timber production, and the list really goes on and on. And the message that I wanted to convey is that none of these things are incompatible with creating a fire resilient landscape. And in fact, managing for many of those things will increase your forest's fire resiliency. So as you're thinking about your ownership and your forest, there's a lot of things that you might consider, whether it's climate change, insects, disease. You might be looking at the types of tree species that you're planting, particularly in response to climate change. You might be concerned about invasive species or other factors like maybe roads that run through your property or other things that could be potential hazards in terms of a fire start. And I always like to recommend that landowners think about developing a plan that really takes stock of what you have on your property and outlines a lot of your goals and helps you start thinking about how you're going to achieve them. So I want to transition now and just kind of close out today's webinar by talking a little bit about landowner assistance and some of the programs that are available to help you with the things that we've discussed here. And I'll start by just kind of talking about the three components of assistance. The first is technical assistance, and that's really the person that you're working with. That might be a stewardship forester from ODF. It could be an OSU extension forester, or somebody else from a watershed council, soil and water conservation district, or even a local professional forestry consultant that you might hire. And these are the folks that come out and walk around and talk with you and help you with some of that planning, and often also help you get into programs that can provide the other component, which is financial assistance. And we have, thankfully, access here in Oregon to a number of cost share programs that do provide assistance to landowners to help offset some of the costs of this work. Oftentimes, the work can be cost prohibitive, and we recognize also that there's not necessarily any kind of immediate economic return, particularly when we're talking about forest management. So these come in the ways of rebates, refunds, or cost share, which is typically in the neighborhood of 50 to 75%. And there are also some increasingly limited tax incentives. And the third piece of it is match. So it's that 25 to 50% that we're asking the landowner to contribute. So it's your contribution. That typically comes in the form of cash or in-kind contributions, meaning that you go and do some of the work yourself. So I've got kind of a busy slide here that talks about some of the different programs that are available in Oregon to provide both technical and financial assistance to landowners. As I mentioned earlier, most of these are in the neighborhood of 50 to 75%. Some of them are 100%. It's variable. And it's really difficult for me to get into the specifics of programs because it really depends on what's available locally. I get a lot of phone calls and people ask me, well, what's available where I live? And my answer is that it's best to reach out to someone locally to find out what you qualify for. And I'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. But generally speaking, our financial assistance programs fall into a few different buckets, and I've tried to list them here. Through ODF, we have access to assistance for developing management plans. We also have some programs that focus on forest health. I'm highlighting a bark beetle mitigation program here. And then on the fuels and fire management side, we've got funding available to help with fuels treatments and some of the work that's been highlighted here in this presentation. In Oregon, we also partner with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, to help landowners access their environmental quality incentives program. And that is one of our primary means of allowing landowners access to cost share to help with treatments that focus primarily on forest health, but of course they do have those ancillary benefits for creating a fire resilient stand. And then finally, we also partner with the Farm Service Agency to help with the establishment of trees in stream areas, and also to provide assistance to landowners who have been impacted by wildfire or other natural disasters like ice storms or insects, help them to reestablish trees and forest stands that have been damaged. So I think this is, really kind of a key component. So how do I navigate this process? As I said earlier, availability of these programs changes often from year to year. And when people ask, well, what's available, I encourage them to reach out to somebody locally that they trust, that they work with. I've got Hans Rudolph pictured here. He's a stewardship forester with ODF out of Pendleton. There are a lot of resources for folks around the state. And I just suggest that you work those relationships that you have. And when you're asking and inquiring about these programs, take note of what's available, and also consider that they often have limited sign-up periods, and they are in different focus areas that move around. So knowing those details can help you kind of know when to jump and get into a program when it's available. And finally, it's also important to recognize that a lot of these programs are delivered by multiple partners. So for instance, an ODF stewardship forester might provide the technical assistance and come out on your property and work with you, but the financial arrangement might be with NRCS in that example. And the program requirements vary. So it's really important to be talking with your both the technical assistance provider as well as the financial assistance provider to understand the details of those programs. And I also wanted to close by briefly highlighting Oregon's Partnership for Forestry Education and the knowyourforest.org website. This is a great partnership we have here in Oregon that is represented here by all the logos you see. We've got a lot of great resources available for small woodland owners at knowyourforest.org. And finally, just wanted to throw contact information up on the screen here for Jenna and for me, and also highlight that on the Oregon Department of Forestry's website, we do have tools that can help you locate both the closest ODF office, field office, as well as your local stewardship forester. We also have a Find a Forester tool. So that's what I've got for right now, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Carrie.
Great, thank you so much to all the speakers. Really, I asked each of the speakers to speak on pretty big topics that actually could take a while, have taken half-day workshops and whatnot to go over. And so I think they've done a really good job of providing the viewership today with a quick overview of fire behavior, embers, risk, and then the home ignition zone and where you can get assistance. So I really want to thank you all for speaking to us today. And if you wouldn't mind going ahead and turning on your video, we're going to now launch into our final poll, and then we'll get to the questions. I've got 13 questions up here. So let me go ahead and launch that next poll. And so it's launched right now. And what this poll is just getting a sense if you were satisfied with the webinar today and maybe some of the actions that you think that you might take in the future. That really helps us to understand you all and what the things that you learned today that you might put into action. And also it just helps us make better outreach opportunities for you in the future. So thank you in advance for taking this evaluation. This is really important for us. So I'm going to launch into the poll and I will be your moderator. We have, like I said, 13 questions. We have about 10 minutes to get through 13 questions, but the speakers have generously said to me that they would stay online for an additional 15 minutes if we don't get through by 2 o'clock. So don't worry, we'll get to your questions. So I'm just going to go down the line and read as they came in. And so I'll start with any thoughts on anti-fire gels that can be sprayed on the sides of barns and homes? They have a friend in South California where CAL FIRE told him that the gel he put on actually saved his house from burning. So I don't know who wants to take that, but what about gel?
So, hey, Dan, you want to take that?
Well, we've used foam or gel, or over the years, there are many products that are commercially available. And we've wrapped structures with fire-resistant paper or materials. Or aluminum based, like putting a big fire shelter over a building. And we've used gels, we've used foams, and you know, depending on the intensity and severity of the fire, it's worked in some cases. But again, if the structure is in the middle of all of the things Jenna and Steve have talked about not putting around the house, it doesn't do much good. But if you've taken the other measures that they have talked about, and then on top of that, it's like putting a sprinkler system on top of your roof or around your building. You know, just added precaution, but on its own, unless you do everything else, may not be that effective, from my experience.
Thanks for that, Daniel. We have another question. It's around risk. And so this person says that they live in Josephine County and they've seen several posts on chat lines that people are doing outdoor burns, and their neighbors say that they have no one in the government to complain to. So my neighbors feel powerless to get people to stop burning. What is the best way to report burning or folks that are burning so that they don't burn during the fire season? And I don't know, maybe this is best for the Oregon Department of Forestry to take.
Thanks, Carrie. I'll jump in here. This isn't my expertise specifically, but I do know that if people are burning and they're not supposed to, and if somebody sees that, they need to either report it to the fire department or the Oregon Department of Forestry. It sort of depends on what district or jurisdiction that the people who are burning in are, and if they don't have anybody who's covering, you know, if it's an area that isn't covered by the Oregon Department of Forestry or the fire department, and it's kind of this no man's land. There are areas in Oregon like that. There may not be anything that they can do, but if they are in a fire department district or Oregon Department of Forestry, there's definitely fines and things that you know, they can definitely get in trouble for burning when they're not supposed to, especially during fire season and things like that. So I would highly encourage them to reach out to any local ODF office or fire department, and either one should be able to give them some information or get somebody out there to cite the people who are burning.
Right, and that goes back to what Ryan was saying in his presentation. You know, just go to the person you trust in your local area, whether that be the Oregon Department of Forestry or, you know, a local fire department. So I have a lot of questions around roofing, and so I'm going to put them all together and ask asphalt versus composite versus metal.
I can take a stab at that. We could do an entire webinar on the flame resistance of building materials, but to focus on roofing, the Underwriters Laboratory have classified the flame resistance of roofing into 3 categories. Category A is the most flame resistant. And of all the roofing materials in category A, the most flame resistant, steel, and you could have steel shingles or you can have steel sheeting, is the most flame resistant of all materials. and the longest lasting. Paint can fade, but steel is steel. And it takes a super high temperature to even affect for an ember. In fact, Class A rated roofing materials are supposed to retard, they can withstand a 2-foot square ember falling on the roof. They don't spread, and they'll last. Tile, concrete, or clay tiling is next. And that's, the risk is that it's real hard, it's expensive and hard to put on. Very few contractors know how to do that, but it's the next flame resistant material. The Class B roofing materials are, you start off with asphalt shingles, and asphalt shingles have 3 categories among it too. Asphalt shingles, if you want which is the most common roofing material in the country, 80% of all homes are made up of asphalt shingles. And the problem with asphalt shingles, even if you get A-rated asphalt shingles, it's the best asphalt shingle you can get, but it will still break down over time. It'll still lose its resistance. And if it's a fiberglass-based asphalt shingle, it will break down in a number of years. And it does not withstand as much heat, as, of course, as steel does. So, and the class, I call it a Class F building material, grade F would be your wood shingles, of course, your wood shakes, and which is the most flammable, even if treated. So that's the rating for roofing materials.
Great, thank you for that, Daniel. So I didn't mention early on, and I should have, I apologize for that, and hopefully she's still online with us, but we also have Megan Fitzgerald McGowan on the line with us. She is the program coordinator at the National Fire Protection Association, and she supports the FireWise program. And Megan, I don't know if you're still on with us, but if you are, why don't you go ahead and pop your video on and unmute yourself, because I have a question coming your way. Is there funding for crews to help with creating a FireWise community?
Can you hear me?
I can. And hi, thank you for being online with us today.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm kind of wasn't prepared to be on video, but thank you for the opportunity.
We're putting you on the spot.
That's all right. So this is a good question. It's actually better turned back to the state. When we look at the national program, we do not have funding that we provide to up and coming communities. It's just not within our capacity to do that. We do have a small funding award through a different project that can assist in this, but it's not typical. But I know sometimes there are state funded opportunities, at least in other states, where they assist you with the work. But I think Jenna might have something to say towards this.
If I can get myself unmuted, here we go. Yeah, thanks, Megan. Yeah, so at the state level, it is similar, obviously, to the NFPA. We don't provide specific funding for FireWise, but we do have programs that integrate the FireWise program into that grant or into that program. So there's Title III funding sometimes at certain counties that can help pay for that. That's a county grant that often does FireWise programs or establishes FireWise communities and maybe does some fuels mitigation work with those communities. We have a state level grant called the Western States Fire Managers Grants that we apply to at a district level in the state. That's not like a community could apply for it. But generally, we integrate in the FireWise program. So if a district was going to apply for a grant, they would say, well, we want to establish 2 FireWise programs with part of that money. And then they would maybe have some funds available that they could put on the ground. So it kind of, there's not really funding. There's also a couple other grants at the state level, but there's not really funding specifically that the community could reach out to, but there is the state level funding that could trickle down into those communities. So To make a very complicated question more simple, I would say reach out to your local ODF office, or even the fire department sometimes has things available, or the county. Those are the three, to just check and see if they have any established programs that could provide some funding for them.
Carrie, may I please give a pitch for these landscape efforts as far as landowner funding, or are we out of time?
Well, we are at 2:00, Daniel, so hold that thought. For
Okay.
those of you that need to bug offline here, because we are at time, I just wanted to let you know that next week, Friday, the same time, 1:00, but until 2:30, we're having the last of 3 webinars, and that webinar focuses on fire adapted communities and what it means to be ready, set, go. The webinar also includes a live demonstration from, like I said, that CERT member who's going to show us what is in their go bag. So it's going to be a really exciting webinar. I hope that you all can join online with us today. And so, like I said, the speakers are willing to stay online. We do have, the questions keep coming in. We have 14 questions left. We'll stay online for another 15 minutes and try to get through those as best as possible. But if you need to, head out to do whatever you were going to do for the rest of the day, go for it. And I just thank you so much for joining us. And so, Daniel, in brief, if you could tell us about those landscape efforts, because we do have, here comes another question, 15 questions to get through.
Oh, sure. Just real quick, and thank you. In Klamath and Lake County and in other landscape efforts around the state, the organizations, partnerships, putting those landscape efforts together, public, private land, through an economy of scale, have been successful in acquiring grant money through either EQIP, NRCS, or OWEB, or Joint Chiefs, or there are other, as well as ODF, Western states, and state and private, and they're using their partnerships as bases to acquire funding for private land treatment of reducing risk and hazard. Okay, thanks, Carrie.
No worries. Thank you for that, Daniel. So we've got a question here. There's ecological damage when someone builds a home within the wildland. What is the additional ecological damage when someone creates a defensible space using home ignition zone recommendations?
Okay, obviously I'll take this one. Maybe Ryan could even jump in here too, but that's a difficult question to answer because it depends on what are they doing with their defensible space. Like because home ignition zone is more of just information of what you can do around the home, what you're deciding to do or not do around the home. That's going to play a part into that, right? If you're going to plant a bunch of plants that are not native and, rock the entire property, that is going to have a higher ecological damage than if somebody's going to just put a little bit of rock directly around the home a foot or two out and then create some really nice kind of habitat islands around their property that's going to encourage native plants and animals and wildlife and things like that. So I don't think that, I agree that building in areas where there's possibility of lots of habitat and building homes is never really super good for the environment, but I think that doing the hazard ignition zone can actually be beneficial sometimes because if you have a lot of invasive species or things like that of growing on the property, if you remove them and you replant fire resistive plants and create more of a native type of environment, you might actually be putting ecological benefits back into the home. So it varies. And I think it really comes down to what is the property owner, what is their goals, and what Ryan talked about, marrying your goals for your property with kind of reducing fire risk at one time. That's where I would leave it with that.
Great. Are all bark chips mulch considered high risk? Jenna, I think you're going to be busy on the Q&A.
So
I'll let Stephen go. I'll let him go.
I'll take this one. Okay. So think about bark chips and think about them as a fuel, and they're small. and they're layered down. And so because they're in contact with the ground, they have some moisture to them, depends on how much irrigation they get. But the surface of that can often dry out if you're trying to save on water. And if you get a ember that lands in it, you probably are not going to see big flames. But what it can do is it can ignite the surface of the bark, which would be dry, and then it starts to smolder. And as it smolders, it kind of moves through. You don't really see many flames. You might not even see much smoke. And then it moves to the house. If there's any wood that's in close proximity to the house, it can then begin to ignite that. Sometimes I have seen bark that has heated up, created by spontaneous combustion. We've seen that over in Central Oregon, where creating bark fires. And so it's more common than you think. And so, as Jenna mentioned, having maybe some kind of non-burnable material, like an ornamental rock within the first, say, 2 to 4 feet around your foundation. And then if you have landscape plants beyond that with some bark or whatever, that helps break up that continuity that I talked about of the bark fuel.
Mm-hmm. Some more fuel questions for you. What about ornamental grasses? Are they high risk?
They can be. It depends on how tall and how much fuel they contain, and whether, if they're bunched versus, and are they close to the home? So let's say that you've got a bunch of this ornamental grass and it's tall and it's got a lot of dead material in it, and it's near the home or near some other vegetation, and an ember gets into it and there's some dead material within that ornamental grass, then you have a situation where you have ignition. Mm-hmm. And then the fire can then move from that grass. I mean, if you keep the grass clipped, of course, most people, the ornamental grass is actually fairly tall, but if it's vigorous and moist, that reduces the chance. I probably would not have it next to my house. I'd have it further away. So you just want to prevent creating a wick-like situation of continuity where a fire can ignite something and then it's conveyed to the home through an avenue or a fuel.
Mm-hmm. Steve, one more for you. How flammable is salal?
It's fairly flammable. If you keep it moist, it takes a little bit to ignite it, but it produces really dark, hot smoke. It's got a lot of oils in it. One of the ones that I worry about across Oregon and is one that Jenna brought up on the Oak Knoll fire down in Ashland, and that is a Leland cypress. If there's anything I could wish away, it would be Leland cypress. Leland cypress, a lot of it's planted because it creates a really nice buffer, all right, because it's dense. It's has a lot of oils in it. And when the Oak Knoll fire started, it started near I-5, just below Ashland, and firebrands embers went across the highway, ignited the grass and the fuel, and the Leland cypress acted as a wick and actually conveyed the fire to those homes. And they went like a domino until I think it's the last house you showed, Jenna, where it ran out of fuel, and that's where it stopped. But the Leland cypress is one I would not have around my home or, within my landscape.
Thanks, Steve. So how does the type of vegetation impact the dimension guidelines? So what types of vegetation dictate greater or lesser distances in defensible space? For example, do juniper trees require greater defensible space than ponderosa?
Well, I can take that. It kind of depends a little bit on. So if you have a home that has a slope below it, it doesn't matter what species of trees you have, you're going to have to space that out because, as I mentioned, topography affects how fires move. And so if you're property has a slope, fire can move uphill much quicker than downhill because it's preheating the fuel. The flames are preheating the fuels more effectively in front of it. But if you live in Central Oregon where maybe you only have juniper, I probably wouldn't want any around my home, but further away, and I'd have them pruned up. And the same with ponderosa pine. But Western juniper is pretty volatile, has a lot of oils in it. And so it readily catches on fire and burns hot and throws a lot of embers.
Mm-hmm. Some homeowners are very proactive with creating that defensible space, but their neighbors are not. Do you have any tips for how a homeowner can approach a neighbor whose home has a lot of hazards that make their home more vulnerable to a fire along with their neighbors?
I'll take this one. Oh, neighbors, right? I say that we run into this kind of thing quite often. So a good question, but not always an easy answer. It depends on obviously the neighbor and what kind of things are important to them. So I think that Firewise communities are a really great way to approach neighbors that have issues, because you can be establishing a Firewise community with the entire community, so it's not singling that person out, but creates an avenue for fire technical expertise people from the fire department or ODF. They can approach then that person and kind of talk to them about technical expert thing, letting them know kind of from the technical side, rather than the neighbor coming to sort of say, hey, you need to clean up your stuff, it's a problem. Having kind of the fire experts on your side coming out to talk to them would be a great way to do it, especially if they're already talking to the rest of the neighborhood, so it doesn't feel like they're being kind of pigeonholed. That would be my tip with that. If you have a good relationship with them, or if you have a good relationship with somebody else in the neighborhood who's friends with them, you could talk about how great this program is that you're doing, maybe, and how beneficial you found it, and maybe it'll trickle down to them, you know, those kind of things, showing by action yourself if you're their neighbor, and kind of having that like, hey, you know, we're doing this work, showing by action that they can see how good it's working on your property. Those are kind of the only ways I'd say. If you don't want to go over and talk to them, obviously they're not going to be super probably excited, but unless you offer to do the work for them, sometimes that works too.
Right. So what about chipping versus broadcast burning ladder and ground fuels?
Chipping versus, I mean, the question is what's preferable? It really depends on the area. It depends on how easy is it to, you know, what's your financial situation? Can you get a chipper out there? What are the goals of your neighborhood or your property? So if you're going to chip, what are you going to do with all the chips? You know, once you've chipped it, are you having that hauled out? Are you using that for pathways? Burning is incredibly less expensive, but it's also a higher risk. But also we try to follow a lot of really safety guidelines with burning. So your risk shouldn't be too high as long as you have somebody from the fire department or an ODF that is managing that, you know, with you, and you stay safe with it. Your risk is fairly low. But again, it really just depends on where you're at in Oregon, to what you have access to financially, what can you do, you know, what are your goals?
Great, thanks for that, Jenna. Could someone,
I was just going to mention on the slash piece too, just wanted to throw out there the timing of when you create slash can also be really important from a forest health perspective. And so we want to be really thoughtful if we're doing some thinning or some pruning, that we're not leaving large pieces of branches or boles of trees sitting out there untreated, where we might actually increase the likelihood for pests to move into a stand. So thinking about the timing of when you're doing it and having a plan before you go out and create those materials for disposing of them, making them smaller by chipping them or burning them is really important too.
Great, thanks for that, Ryan. We have 1 minute left, one question left. If I didn't get to your question, I think maybe I didn't get to one or two questions. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully the resources I provide you with the follow-up email will help answer the questions that you have. But For our final question, could someone talk about topography, how fires move up or down canyons?
Well, I'll take that. There's a couple of things that relate to it, and maybe Daniel can also weigh in, or anyone else. But so if you think about a canyon, there are often breezes that are associated with a canyon because of the topography, the steep topography and the U shape of it. And a lot of times in the morning or as the day heats up, the slopes above start to warm, and the air begins to rise, and you begin to get some up canyon winds. And these will continue, and they can blow quite hard. If your home is up there, is that not only do you have a slope below you where if a fire ignites, because the flames are slanted towards the slope, they're more effectively preheating the fuel ahead of it, is now you have a wind that it can push it right up. At night, as things cool, the winds reverse in these canyons. So the cold air then begins to descend, and the winds push downslope, and so they can actually push the flames downslope or side slope below it and actually spread the fire in a different direction. And this can go on a daily basis. So if your home is near a slope or even a small canyon, that's a high risk situation. And looking at the fuel around your home, you may want to, as Jenna said, the lean, mean, or not mean, but lean and green. Lean and green.
Lean, clean.
Yeah, clean and green is really, you're going to have to, you'll want to clear the vegetation further down the slope.
Great. Anybody else want to add anything to that? That sounded pretty good to me. We are 2 minutes past 2:15, so I want to, be respectful of everybody's time. Thank again all of the speakers today. Fantastic job, representing huge topics in a small amount of time. Kudos to you all. Kudos to all the questions answered, and thank you, attendees for coming on and listening, taking an interest in, knowing more about what you can do to mitigate your wildfire risk. And so I hope to see you online next week. Watch out for a follow-up email that will provide resources and a link to register for next week's webinar. So with that, I'm going to say happy Friday, everybody. Have a great weekend. Thank you.